says great. That's great. It's wonderful. Put my earrings on. I'm wearing these twice this week because I think they're so cute. Maybe they don't go with this one either. Maybe they're so unique. Good morning, Tate. Happy Friday. You ready for the weekend? Gonna do your... Hi, Kimberly. Hi, Kelly. My Gables girls are already in here and ready to find out what happens. Happy Friday. Look at this rose. You're ready. I have, I feel like I used to know the name of this. All the girls are here. I love it. The name of this kind of, it's like Everblooms? Everblooms? Is that the name? But it's not a bush. It's like a long vine thing. But it's just chock full. And Andrew's here. Chock full of these roses. So bright, so beautiful. Love it. So I peeled one off, but there's a ton of thorns and stuff. You guys, okay, before we get into this, I went and ate dinner at my parents' house last night, and I came back and there was a giant... I came back about 7 o'clock. It was after 7 maybe. A giant black snake slithering on my front stoop, which is concrete. I mean, the thing was like that big around, at least that big around. So if you're new here, when I see an animal, I like to look it up in this Animal Speaks book. And that was actually the third snake I had perceived. I don't want to say saw because I only heard a snake slithering on my run, which was a terrible run, by the way. Do you know this book? I'm going to look it up and read snake medicine, snake totem, just to remind myself. The magic of the reptile world. Oh, it's so in-depth and wild. Oh, I saw a frog yesterday too, which is transformation through water and sound. Cool. Lizards. Seeing lots of reptiles lately. How about you guys? Snake. Rebirth, resurrection, initiation, and wisdom. Hey, Craig, how are you? Oh my goodness. Usually it tells you what time of year. Oh, and I found this giant feather yesterday. Magical. I did not kiss the frog. I did not even touch it. But my son, who was with me, was like, we need to scoot it out of the sun and get it into this ditch so it can have water. It was cute. Like, I think it knows where to go, but we'll do that if you want. Oh, there's so much on it. I'm going to have to read it on my own time, I think. But the snake has long been a symbol of death and rebirth. Before it sheds its skin, its eyes begin to cloud over, as if to indicate it is entering into a stage between life and death. Snake medicine people were those who learned to imitate the snake and move between the realms of life and death for healing and enlightenment. Well, I don't think I necessarily embody the snake. However, this doesn't go here. Interesting. All right, guys. We're ready. Also, really quickly before we read this, I am going to be on Monday, but that will be the last broadcast for a minute. Probably at least a week if I broadcast on Haps while I'm gone. That'll just be a rare freak occurrence. Don't count on it. So I'm sorry to pause and vacation right in the middle of our book, but yeah, so Monday. I'll remind you guys on Monday that I am. And don't say, oh no, that makes me feel bad. We're having so much fun with Anne. All right, this chapter, I hope I do have a good trip. I have anxiety, and I haven't been on a plane since 2019, December 2019. So I have a lot of, we need to finish the book on Monday. No, we can't finish it on Monday. If I die on this trip, though, please do finish the book. I have, yes. I have a lot of trip anxiety, which has developed later in my life. So I didn't used to be terrified when I got on planes and shit. But my eyes twitching thinking about it. I have a lot of anxiety, and it's gonna be fun. It's a vacation. I mean, looking forward to it. Gonna be spending time with my sister and her husband and my nieces, and I should be just overjoyed about it. But I have to head trip about all of the shit that could possibly go wrong, and there's a name for it, catastrophize, or it's like catastrophe anxiety, or I think about, did you hear that frog? Did you hear that frog? It sounded like it was right under my window. Speaking of frogs and snakes, Kelly, I will message you and tell you where I'm going. I have a creepy ex, guys, so I can't be just tell you everything, which I would like to do, but alright, you ready? Chapter 20. Ooh, hold on, I have to put my recording on. One of these times I'm gonna I'm gonna read a chapter and completely forget to record it. That's coming, I'm sure of it. Okay, chapter 21, a new departure in flavorings, and it's spelled the Canadian British way, flavorings. Dear me, there is nothing but meeting and partings in this world, as Mrs. Lynde says, remarked Anne plaintively, putting her slate and books down on the kitchen table on the last day of June, and wiping her red eyes with a very damp handkerchief. Wasn't it fortunate, Marilla, that I took an extra handkerchief to school today? I had a presentiment that it would be needed. I never thought you were so fond of Mr. Phillips that you'd require 2 handkerchiefs to dry your tears just because he was going away, said Marilla. I don't think I was crying because I was really so very fond of him, and can we all breathe a sigh of relief that Mr. Phillips is going away? Thank goodness. It's about time. I don't know what names we can think up to call Mr. Phillips, but none of them are kind. I don't think I was crying because I was really so very fond of him, reflected Anne. I just cried because all the others did. It was Ruby Gillis started it. Ruby Gillis has always declared she hated Mr. Phillips, but just as soon as he got up to make his farewell speech, she burst into tears. Then all the girls began to cry, one after the other. I tried to hold out, Marilla. I tried to remember the time Mr. Phillips made me sit with a boy, and the time he spelled my name without an E on the blackboard, and how he said I was the worst dunce he ever saw at geometry, and laughed at my spelling, and all the times he had been so horrid and sarcastic. But somehow I couldn't, Marilla, and I just had to cry too. Jane and poor Anne, like, he really did treat her badly. Marilla, Jane Andrews has been talking for a month about how glad she'd be when Mr. Phillips went away, and she'd declare she'd never shed a tear. Well, she was worse than any of us and had to borrow a handkerchief from her brother. Of course, the boys didn't cry because she hadn't brought one of her own, not expecting to need it. Oh, Marilla, it was heartrending. Mr. Phillips made such a beautiful farewell speech, beginning, "The time has come for us to part." It was very affecting, and he had tears in his eyes too, Marilla. Oh, I felt dreadfully sorry and remorseful for all the times I'd talked in school and drawn pictures of him on my slate and made fun of him and Prissy. I can tell you, I wish I'd been a model pupil like Minnie. My eye is twitching so bad. Like Minnie Andrews. She hadn't anything on her conscience. The girls cried all the way home from school. Carrie Sloane kept saying every few minutes, "The time has come for us to part. And that would start us off again, whenever we were in any danger of cheering up. I do feel dreadfully sad, Marilla, but one can't feel quite in the depths of despair with 2 months' vacation before them, can they, Marilla? And besides, we met the new minister and his wife coming from the station. For all I was feeling so bad about Mr. Phillips going away, I couldn't help taking a little interest in a new minister, could I? Now they're getting a new minister. His wife is very pretty, not exactly regally lovely. Of course, it wouldn't do, I suppose, for a minister to have a regally lovely wife, because it might set a bad example. I mean, how very dare to be regally lovely, right? Mrs. Lynde said the minister's wife over at Newbridge set a very bad example because she dresses so fashionably. Our new minister's wife is dressed in blue muslin with lovely puffed sleeves and a hat trimmed with roses. Jane Andrews said she thought puffed sleeves were too worldly for a minister's wife, but I didn't make any such uncharitable remark, Marilla, because I know what it is to long for puff sleeves. Because she's only been a minister's wife for a little while, so one should make allowances, shouldn't they? They are going to board with Mrs. Lynde until the manse is ready. If Marilla, in going down to Mrs. Lynde's that evening, was actuated by any motive save her avowed one of returning the quilted frame she had borrowed the preceding winter, it was an amiable weakness shared by most of the Avonlea people. Many a thing Mrs. Lynde had lent, sometimes never expecting to see again, came home that night in charge of the borrowers thereof. Oh, they're just all thinking of some excuse to, like, return something, some excuse to drop by Mrs. Lynde and get a good look at the new minister and his wife, right? A new minister, and moreover a minister with a wife, was a lawful object of curiosity in a quiet little country settlement where sensations were few and far between. Old Mr. Bentley, the minister whom Anne had found lacking in imagination, had been pastor of Avonlea for 18 years. He was a widower when he came, and a widower he remained, despite the fact that gossip regularly married him to this, that, or the other one, every year of his sojourn. In the preceding February, he had resigned his charge and departed amid the regrets of his people, most of whom had the affection born of long intercourse for their good old minister in spite of his shortcomings as an orator. Since then, the Avonlea church had enjoyed a variety of religious dissipation in listening to the many and various candidates and supplies who came Sunday after Sunday to preach on trial. These stood or fell by the judgment of the fathers and mothers in Israel, but A certain small red-headed girl who sat meekly in the corner of the old Cuthbert pew also had her opinions about them, and discussed the same in full with Matthew Marilla, always declining from principle to criticize ministers in any shape or form. I don't think Mr. Smith would have done, Matthew, was Anne's final summing up. Mrs. Lynde says his delivery was so poor, but I think his worst fault was just like Mr. Bentley's. He had no imagination, and Mr. Terry had too much. He let it run away with him, just as I did mine in the matter of the haunted woods. Besides, Mrs. Lynde says his theology wasn't sound. Mr. Gresham was a very good man and a very religious man, but he told too many funny stories and made the people laugh in church. He was undignified, and you must have some dignity about a minister, mustn't you, Matthew? I thought Mr. Marshall was decidedly attractive, but Mrs. Lynde said he isn't married or even engaged because she made special inquiries about him, and she said it would never do to have a young unmarried minister in Avonlea because he might marry in the congregation, and that would make trouble. Scandalous! Mrs. Lynde is a far. I will. I, it's so hard to get over like church scandals. Like it's almost as if you want like people want scandals. Because if you start holding people to like a different set of standards than like I don't know everyday people, it's like a setup for this to happen. And so people are always so shocked when um, preachers and ministers and uh, clerics and stuff have these like you know have these affairs. But it's almost like it's almost inevitable. Um, in the town that I used to live in for a few years, there was a church, a Catholic church, and it was absolutely scandalous that, I mean, this had happened like a few years before I moved there, but completely scandalous um, that the former priest um, gave up the cloth for a lowly woman to marry her, fell in love, still talked about to a random person, an outsider, even, such as myself. Anyway, it's hilarious. Mrs. Lynde is a very far-seeing woman, isn't she, Matthew? I'm very glad they've called Mr. Allen. I liked him because his sermon was interesting and he prayed as if he meant it and not just as if he did it because he was in the habit of it. Mrs. Lynde says he isn't perfect, but she says she supposes we could expect a perfect minister for $750 a year. And anyhow, his theology is sound because she questioned him thoroughly on all points of doctrine. And she knows his wife's people, and they are most respectable, and the women are all good housekeepers. Mrs. Lynde says the sound doctrine in the man and good housekeeping in the woman make an ideal combination for a minister's family. The new minister and his wife, having grown up my own father was a preacher, and part of the job is you have people, other like random people at your house all the time. So yeah, good house, it sounds awful of her to say, but like good housekeeping is like a, I guess, legitimate requirement for the job. The new minister and his wife were a young, pleasant-faced couple, still in their honeymoon and full of all good and beautiful enthusiasm for their chosen life work. Avonlea opened, excuse me, Avonlea opened its heart to them from the start. Old and young liked the frank, cheerful young man and his high ideals, and the bright, gentle lady who assumed the mistress-ship of the manse. With Mrs. Allen, Anne fell promptly and wholeheartedly in love. She had discovered another kindred spirit. They're everywhere! Mrs. Allen is perfectly lovely, she announced one Sunday afternoon. She's taken our class And she's a splendid teacher. She said right away she didn't think it was fair for the teacher to ask all the questions. And you know, Marilla, that is exactly what I always thought. She said we could ask any question we liked, and I asked her ever so many. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla. I believe you, was Marilla's emphatic comment. Nobody else asked any except Ruby Gillis, and she asked if there was to be a Sunday school picnic this summer. I didn't think that was a very proper question to ask because it hadn't any connection with the lesson. The lesson was about Daniel and the lion's den, but Mrs. Allen just smiled and said she thought there would be. Mrs. Allen has a lovely smile. She has such exquisite dimples in her cheeks. I wish I had dimples in my cheeks, Marilla. I'm not half so skinny as I was when I came here, but I have no dimples yet. If I had, perhaps I could influence people for good. Mrs. Allen said we ought always to try to influence other people for good. She talked so nice about everything. I never knew before that religion was such a cheerful thing. I always thought it was kind of melancholy, but Mrs. Allen's isn't, and I'd like to be a Christian if I could be one like her. I wouldn't want to be one like Mr. Superintendent Bell. It's very naughty of you to speak so about Mr. Bell, said Marilla severely. Mr. Bell's a real good man. Oh, of course he's good, agreed Anne, but he doesn't seem to get any comfort out of it. If I could be good, I'd dance and sing all day because I'd be glad of it. I suppose Mrs. Allen isn't too old to dance and sing, and of course it wouldn't be dignified in a minister's wife. But I can just feel she's glad she's Christian and that she'd be one even if she could get to heaven without it. I suppose we must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen up to tea some day soon, said Marilla reflectively. They've been most everywhere but here. Let me see. Next Wednesday would be a good time to have them. But don't say a word to Matthew about it, for if he knew they were coming, he'd find some excuse to be away that day. He's got so used to Mr. Bentley, he didn't mind him. But he's going to find it hard to get acquainted with a new minister, and a new minister's wife will frighten him to death. Poor Matthew. Speaking of anxiety, Matthew has social anxiety to the max. You can make a good layer cake, promised Marilla. I feel like in the Netflix series, it goes into detail and answers like kind of that question, like why Matthew is so anxious around women, more so than the book. Like we actually get answers in the series about that. I don't know that they address that it's addressed in the book. I'll be as secret as the dead, assured Anne. But oh, Marilla, will you let me make a cake for the occasion? I'd love to do something for Mrs. Allen, and you know I can make a pretty good cake by this time. You can make a layer cake, promised Marilla. Monday and Tuesday, great preparations went out at Green Gables. Having the minister and his wife to tea was a serious and important undertaking, and Marilla was determined not to be eclipsed by any of the Avonlea housekeepers. Anne was wild with excitement and delight. She talked it all over with Diana on Tuesday night in the twilight as they sat on the big red stones by the Dryad's bubble and made rainbows in the water with little twigs dipped in fir balsam. Everything is ready, Diana, except my cake, which I am to make in the morning, and the baking powder biscuits, which Marilla will make just before tea time. I assure you, Diana, that Marilla and I have had a busy 2 days of it. It's such a responsibility having a minister's family to tea. I never went through such an experience before. You should just see our pantry. It's a sight to behold. We're going to have jellied chicken and cold tongue. We're to have 2 kinds of jelly, red and yellow, and whipped cream, and lemon pie, and cherry pie, and 3 kinds of cookies, and fruit cake, and Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves that she keeps especially for ministers, and pound cake, and layer cake, and biscuits, as aforesaid, and new bread, and old broth, in case the minister is dyspeptic and can't eat new. Mrs. Lynde says ministers mostly are dyspeptic, but I don't think Mr. Allen has been a minister long enough for it to have had a bad effect on him. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Diana, what if it shouldn't be good? I dreamed last night that I was chased all around by a fearful goblin with a big layer cake for a head. It'll be good, all right, assured Diana, who is a very comfortable sort of friend. I'm sure that piece of the one you made that we had for lunch in Idlewild 2 weeks ago was perfectly elegant. Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out bad just when you especially want them to be good. Oh my God, don't they? Oh, don't they? It's like too much pressure to make like a birthday cake, even though I've definitely done it and tried it. If you're not trying, you'll just make like the best cake in the world. But if it's like a birthday cake or something like important, forget about it. Forget about it. However, I suppose I shall just have. I'm sorry, sighed Anne, setting a particularly well-bosomed twig afloat. However, I suppose I shall just have to trust to Providence and be careful to put in the flour. Oh, look, Diana, what a lovely rainbow. Do you suppose a dryad will come out after we go away and take it for a scarf? You know there's no such thing as a dryad, said Diana. Diana's mother had found out about the haunted wood and had been decidedly angry over it. As a result, Diana had abstained from any further imitative flights of imagination and did not think it prudent to cultivate a spirit of belief even in harmless dryads. But it's so easy to imagine there is, said Anne. Every night before I go to bed, I look out of my window and wonder if the dryad is really sitting there, combing her locks with the spring for a mirror. Sometimes I look for her footprints in the dew in the morning. Oh, Diana, don't give up your faith in the dryad. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She had caught a severe cold in the head by reason of her dabbling in the spring on the preceding evening, but nothing short of absolute pneumonia could have quenched her interest in culinary matters that morning. After breakfast, she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door upon it, she drew a long breath. I'm sure I haven't forgotten anything this time, Marilla, but do you think it will rise? Just suppose perhaps the baking powder isn't good. I used it out of the new can, and Mrs. Lynde says you can never be sure of getting good baking powder nowadays when everything is so adulterated. Mrs. Lynde said the government ought to take the matter up, but she says we'll never see the day when a Tory government will do it. Marilla, what if that cake doesn't rise? We'll have plenty without it, was Marilla's unimpassioned way of looking at the subject. The cake did rise, however, and came out of the oven as light and feathery as golden foam. Anne, flushed with delight, clapped it together with layers of ruby jelly. Malik is in here, hello! And in imagination saw Mrs. Allen eating it and possibly asking for another piece. You'll be using the best tea set, of course, Marilla, she said. Can I fix up the table with ferns and wild roses? I think that's all nonsense, sniffed Marilla. In my opinion, it's the eatables that matter and not flummery decorations. Mrs. Barry had her table decorated, said Anne, who was not entirely guiltless of the wisdom of the serpent, and the minister paid her an elegant compliment. He said it was a feast for the eye as well as the palate. Well, yes. Do as you like, said Marilla, who was quite determined not to be surpassed by Mrs. Barry or anybody else. Only mind you leave enough room for the dishes and the food. Anne laid herself out to decorate in a manner and after a fashion that should leave Mrs. Barry's nowhere. Having an abundance of roses and ferns and a very artistic taste of her own, she made that tea table such a thing of beauty that when the minister and his wife sat down to it, they exclaimed in chorus over its loveliness. It's Anne's doing, said Marilla grimly, just. And Anne felt that Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness for this world. Matthew was there, having been inveigled into the party only goodness and Anne knew how. He had been in such a state of shyness and nervousness that Marilla had given him up in despair, but Anne took him in hand so successfully that he now sat at the table in his best clothes and white collar and talked to the minister not uninterestingly. He never said a word to Mrs. Allen, but that perhaps was not to be expected. All went merry as a marriage bell until Anne's layer cake was passed. Uh-oh. Mrs. Allen, having already been helped to a bewildering variety, declined it. But Marilla, seeing the disappointment on Anne's face, said smilingly, Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen. Anne made it on purpose for you. In that case, I must sample it, laughed Mrs. Allen, helping herself to a plump triangle, as did also the minister and Marilla. Mrs. Allen took a mouthful of hers, and a most peculiar expression crossed her face. Not a word did she say, however, but steadily ate away at it. Marilla saw the expression and hastened to taste the cake. Anne Shirley, she exclaimed, what on earth did you put into that cake? Nothing but what the recipe said, Marilla, cried Anne with a look of anguish. Oh, isn't it all right? All right, it's simply horrible. Mrs. Allen, don't you eat it. Anne, taste it yourself. What flavoring did you use? Vanilla, said Anne. First of all, Marilla needs to label her jars. Anne is not completely at fault here. Vanilla, said Anne, her face scarlet with mortification after tasting the cake. Only vanilla. Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder. I had my suspicions of that. Baking powder, fiddlesticks. Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used. Anne fled to the pantry, returned with a small bottle, partially filled with the brown liquid and labeled yellowly, best vanilla. Marilla took it, uncorked it, smelled it. Mercy on us, Anne, you flavored that cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week and poured what was left into an old empty vanilla bottle. I suppose it's partly my fault. Partly? It is. I should have warned you, but for pity's sake, why couldn't you have smelled it? Maybe because she's not a master baker like you, Marilla. We all can't be as perfect as you. Anne dissolved into tears under this double disgrace. I couldn't. I had such a cold. Right, I forgot about that. And with this, she fairly fled to the gable chamber, where she cast herself on the bed and wept as one who refuses to be comforted. Presently, a light step sounded on the stairs, and somebody entered the room. Oh, Marilla, sobbed Anne without looking up. I'm disgraced forever. I shall never be able to live this down. It will get out. Things always do get out in Avonlea. Diana will ask me how my cake turned out, and I shall have to tell her the truth. I shall always be pointed at as the girl who flavored a cake with anodyne liniment. Gil, the boys in school will never get over laughing at it. Oh, Marilla, if you have a spark of Christian pity, don't tell me I must go down and wash the dishes after this. I'll wash them when the minister and his wife are gone, but I cannot ever look Miss Allen in the face again. Perhaps she'll think I tried to poison her. Mrs. Lynde said she knows an orphan girl who tried to poison her benefactor, but the liniment isn't poisonous. It's meant to be taken internally, although not in cakes. Won't you tell Mrs. Allen so, Marilla? We're going to have to look what anodyne liniment is, do some research and post it on Twitter. Suppose you jump up and tell her yourself, said a merry voice. Anne flew up to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed, surveying her with laughing eyes. My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this, she said, genuinely disturbed by Anne's tragic face. Why, it's all just a funny mistake that anybody might make. Oh, no, it takes me to make such a mistake, said Anne forlornly, and I wanted to have that cake so nice for you, Mrs. Allen. Yes, I know, dear, and I assure you I appreciate your kindness and thoughtfulness just as much as if it had turned out all right. Now, you mustn't cry any more, but come down with me and show me your flower garden. Miss Cuthbert tells me you have a little plot all of your own. I want to see it, for I'm very much interested in flowers. Anne permitted herself to be led down and comforted, reflecting that it was really providential that Mrs. Allen was a kindred spirit. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake, and when the guests went away, Anne found that she had enjoyed the evening more than could have been expected, considering that terrible incident. Nevertheless, she sighed deeply. Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it? I'll warrant you'll make plenty in it, said Marilla. I never saw your beat for making mistakes, Anne. Yes, and, well, I know it, admitted Anne mournfully. But have you ever noticed one encouraging thing about me, Marilla? I never make the same mistake twice. I don't know as that's much benefit when you're always making new ones. Oh, don't you see, Marilla? There must be a limit to the mistakes one person can make. And when I get to the end of them, I'll be through with them. That's a very comforting thought. Well, you'd better go and give that cake to the pig, said Marilla. It isn't fit for any human to eat, not even Jerry Butte, a little French farm boy. And that's our chapter. Now, if we were having an Anne of Green Gables themed party, we would definitely have to make some kind of liniment cake. What would we flavor it with to make it edible? And just tell everybody that it was liniment cake. Maybe it'd be nice. Maybe like a rose and cardamom. I love that flavor pairing. It's one of my favorites. But maybe have like blue or green icing too, or anise to fool people, or lavender and lemon, which has sort of a maybe medicinal taste to it. Oh my gosh! Now I want to have a Anne of Green Gables party, and we could have currant wine cocktails. So many things, couldn't we? All right, that's it. You guys have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday morning.